In Chinese history, there is a phrase that almost everyone knows: eunuch interference in politics, as if the moment eunuchs hold power, a dynasty is doomed. But there is something strange about this explanation. If the bureaucratic system was truly functioning, why would an emperor hand power to eunuchs? No emperor ever came to the throne and said, "I want eunuchs to run my country." So maybe the truth is the opposite. Eunuchs gaining power was never the cause, it was the result. Every emperor faced the same eternal dilemma. He needed people to do his work, but everyone who worked for him could become a threat. Civil officials had students, families, and networks of interest. Their loyalty often belonged not to the emperor himself, but to their own faction. Military generals had armies and could become a rival center of power at any moment. Imperial relatives had royal blood and the possibility of replacing him. But eunuchs were different. They had no descendants. Power could not be inherited, no family, no easy way to build external alliances. Everything they had came from the emperor. Without him, they were nothing. In the emperor's eyes, eunuchs were actually the safest people around him, not because they were more loyal, but because they had no conditions for betrayal. But this sense of safety was only the precondition. What truly brought eunuchs onto the stage of power was a deeper problem. The bureaucratic system was beginning to fail. When a dynasty ran normally, the chain of command was clear. The emperor gave orders, court officials executed them, local governments carried them out. But when corruption spread, when factional wars intensified, when information was filtered through layer after layer, the emperor faced a fatal situation. He no longer knew the truth. What the emperor saw was a trimmed version of reality, a world where even famine could be written up as a year of abundance. He sat deep inside the palace, receiving only processed information, hearing only what others wanted him to hear. He needed a channel that bypassed the entire system, someone who reported only to him, obeyed only him, and belonged to no outside faction. Eunuchs perfectly met this need. They lived inside the palace, stayed by the emperor's side 24 hours a day, and belonged to no civil official group. The rise of eunuchs was not because they were more capable, not because they were more trustworthy. It was because the emperor had begun to bypass his entire bureaucracy. Wei Zhongxian of the Ming Dynasty was the most extreme demonstration of this logic. When Emperor Tianqi was on the throne, the war between the Donglin faction and other groups had already torn the court apart. He was not a strong ruler. He was more absorbed in woodworking than in handling the complexities of governing. But the empire could not stop. He needed someone completely dependent on him, belonging to no civil faction, who could handle everything on his behalf without ever threatening his position. Wei Zhongxian was that person. His power was not stolen, it was handed over by the emperor himself. He was used to suppress the Donglin faction, to restructure the court, to keep the empire running. In a sense, Wei Zhongxian was not a usurper. He was more like a replacement system that was needed into existence. One could even argue, without him, the Ming Dynasty at that point might have collapsed even faster. But this logic had a fatal flaw. Eunuchs may have had no families, but they were still human. Once power concentrated in their hands, they too formed internal factions. They too controlled the flow of information. They too monopolized the emperor's view of the world. At first, eunuchs were just tools. Then, they became the ones who filtered information. In the end, they became reality itself in the emperor's eyes. The emperor believed he was controlling the eunuchs. In truth, the eunuchs were deciding what he could see, what he could hear, what he could believe. The emperor used eunuchs to solve the problem of a broken bureaucracy, but the eunuchs themselves became an even bigger problem. This was not a matter of one person's moral failure. It was a structural inevitability. When you bypass a broken system, the alternative channel you build will eventually break too, and break even worse, because that channel has no institutional checks. Its only restraint is the emperor's own judgment, and the emperor's judgment had already been filtered by it. This cycle repeated itself throughout Chinese history. In the late Eastern Han, eunuchs and imperial relatives took turns controlling the court. The emperor became a puppet. This directly gave rise to the chaos of the three kingdoms. In the mid to late Tang Dynasty, eunuchs seized command of the palace guards and could even depose and install emperors. In the Ming, from Wang Zhen to Liu Jin to Wei Zhongxian, the same pattern played out again and again. Bureaucracy fails. The emperor loses trust. Eunuchs are brought in. Eunuchs grow too powerful. The system deteriorates further. Dynasties changed, names changed, but the cycle never did. Eunuchs did not break this cycle. They were simply part of it. People always like to blame a dynasty's failure on a particular group, corrupt ministers, eunuchs, imperial relatives, because it's simple and it feels reassuring. But the real danger was never about any group of people. It was about a system that began to rely on exceptions to function. When all power is concentrated at a single point and that point becomes blocked, the system's options for alternatives become extremely limited. Either rely on whoever is closest or build special channels with no oversight. And both options share one trait. They answer to only one person with no institution capable of restraining them. The more concentrated the power, the more extreme the methods of correction, and the more uncontrollable the consequences. When an empire needs more and more special channels just to maintain basic functions, its problems have already become irreparable. Eunuchs did not destroy the empire. They were simply the last part still running,